Okay guys, here we have the new HBX Solarbloc. Instead of the black colored pump, this is kind of an orange colored pump, and it's 145 watts max instead of 110 watts. So it's actually a Grundfos, I believe, and it'll power a lot more water through your system. So you can probably have another collector versus the other pump, and it's gives a bit more head lift of water as well. Now, when you're assembling this, I've already assembled the intake port on this side. This is from your coil from your hot water tank, and then there's another input on this side. This is from your dump load or your second tank. And then we have the one-way valve that's built into this last piece, so the flow can only go this way. This is the output. This goes in here, and the problem is that you have to remove the pump and the pump body on here to get this in and get this little stainless circlip in there, because there's no way you can fit that in there after you push this in, because all this stuff's in the way. On the output here you have your flow sensor. So this flow sensor basically mounts on that output, and you need to have at least 6 or 8 inches after this flow sensor before your pipe does a bend. Otherwise the flow sensor won't be accurate, so just keep that in mind. And if you give me just a minute here, I'll show you the rest of it. Okay, this is the output fitting. It has a one-way valve in there to prevent thermosiphon. The flow goes through this way. If we pull this apart, you can see the little valve on the inside. The way it works is that little ball on the inside there gets pushed forward by the fluid flow. As it's pushed forward, you can see the fluid come through and go in that direction. If it tries to thermosiphon in a reverse direction, there's a tiny spring in there and it just seals that up tight, so there's no flow in the reverse direction. So make sure that that valve is oriented correctly in your output fitting. Now these pieces here will get sweat soldered to your 3/4 pipe. Make sure you put on the nut, slide the nut over the pipe first, make your solder connection, slide the nut forward, put the rubber in there, and fit it on the end of the fitting. Okay? Same thing goes for your flow sensor. You want to pull these off, make your sweat fittings, solder onto here, 3/4 inch pipe. When it's all cool, then you bolt it up, because this is a resin type plastic, so you don't want to be doing any soldering on this plastic. Okay, now I'm going to show you how to remove this pump body so that we can put this output fitting on this top port here. You'll see the other port is there as well, but it's sealed. There's nothing to go in there. And also the bracket that the pump fits on, that it comes with, blocks this port down here, so there's no mistaking this is the output port. Okay, first things first, we take one of the supplied rubber O-rings and basically just work it over the end there. You can use some spit or something to lube that up to push it in the hole once we get the pump off. So to pull the pump off, basically you have to undo all these Allen key bolts here. I've got them mainly undone already. Okay. There's a few cable connections in the pump as well, but there's probably enough slack that we don't have to worry about that. Okay, now we just basically yank up on this guy. Hopefully these are all loose. Okay, they're quite long bolts. It's probably best to pop them out one at a time. There we are. Okay. So there's enough slack in this wire, and there's enough slack in the power supply wire that comes from the controller, that we can just pop that on there like so. You can see the inside of the pump. There's nothing fancy there. It's basically a centrifugal pump. Okay, try not to drop this guy on the floor here. Just lube up that rubber. And you have to really jiggle it, but force it in good. As you hold it in, pop the pin in. If the pin doesn't go in, push it together a little bit. Just wiggle it around. There we go. Make sure it's all the way seated. Don't force it if it doesn't go in, you're doing something wrong, okay? Now I've got all the fittings in there. I'll just position this back on there, like so. Pop in your 4 Allen key bolts. This is a 4mm Allen key. And then you're good to go. Make all your copper connections. Mount the pump to the supplied bracket. And you can mount the pump through the actual bracket that this mounts on the wall with. Is not really a support for the pump, but it supports all the fittings, these brass fittings that fit in the pump. So I'll show you how that fits in just a second here. So that's all nice and tight. Don't go crazy tight, just good and tight. That's it. The fittings are all on. So you have your input from your hot water tank, you have your input from your dump load or radiators or second tank, and here's your output that goes through the flow sensor and then back up to the roof. Okay, on the instructions for the flow sensor, you can clearly see an arrow there, so and an arrow on this side, so your flow is always going that way. This part here, the actual sensor itself that you can see inside the tube, can be removed and replaced. Generally you won't have to touch that. In this case, this one's already mounted. Alright, I'll show you how the fittings go on here. Standard, same way you do your sweat fitting, and you've got your rubber on the inside there. There's 2 O-rings that are larger in diameter than the O-rings that fit in the brass fittings here. So make sure you use the O-rings that are meant for the flow sensor. Just push those in there firm. You can see they barely stick out, but they need to be in there. And then you mount your brass fitting to that, tighten it up. And when you're tightening these up, make sure you use a wrench to hold the flow sensor here, and then tighten this nut and tighten this nut. You don't want to go over tight on these, because remember, this is going brass to a plastic fitting, so don't go crazy on these. Just get it so it's not leaking, and then a little bit more. Okay, here we have the aluminum bracket, and the way it fits in, you can see there's holes here on the back for mounting this unit. So what you want to do as you mount this down, as you slide it down, you want to be aware of the holes in the back and make sure you're aligning it properly. One side always fits better than the other, of course. There we go. Okay, you can see how the bracket goes in the grooves, and you want the flat part that has no grooves on the top of these fittings. As you can see, the flat part is facing the top. Now on the back side, the 2 mounting holes line up fairly well. And when you're mounting this, you can use deck screws or whatever, but if you're using deck screws, you want to put a washer on there, because that is a flat head right there, and it's also a flat head right here. Ideally, if you're using a machine head flat type screw that's at least 2.5–3 inches long, you're going to have some plywood that you mount on your drywall, and this will screw right to your wall, and you can make all your plumbing connections from there. So that's the new HBX Solarbloc with the bigger pump.